This is basically part of my writing process. So I run the website RoamStack, and what I've noticed talking to new users is that the concept of outliners is often difficult to grasp. So, like, not the concept of bullets or indentation per se, but what that those concepts make possible. So that is what I want to dive deep into this session. Like I said, this is part of my process. So if you follow me on Twitter, I first created a Twitter thread today about basically this talk, turned that into talking points here, and this talk and outline will serve as an article I will release later this week. But outliners, or the concept of outliners, I think that's a fundamental part of really getting the most out of Roam research. So if you have been using Roam for a while, or even if you're new to Roam, but you feel like I don't really use the outline structure, I just dump text in it and I don't really worry about the structure or indentation, stuff like that, you're in the right session. If you're more thinking of graphs, so linking a block directly to another block through the address, so through the block reference, that is outside the scope of this session. So we're really going to dive deep into what are outliners and what does that structure mean apply to Roam. So let's get started with the first concept, or the first section. So we'll have 4 sections in this talk. The first is what are outliners, then what are the fundamental parts of an outliner. So we'll then have a specific look at Roam, 5 fundamental parts of Roam, several use cases for outliners. And remember, outliners are great, but they're not great for everything. So just be aware to use the right tool for the job. And then if you still don't really intuitively get outliners, so if you don't still grok the concept of the outliner, we'll have a look at a few examples of outliners in the wild, and I'll give you a few lenses to look through. So like maybe structures you already know that you haven't thought of being an outliner. I know a little bit mysterious, but we'll get there. So first, what are outliners? Let's start with the definition. I think that's the easiest. It sounds very logical, but an outliner is basically a software tool that lets you create outlines. That's it. It doesn't have to be really fancy. And then again, what is an outline? Well, we're looking at one. This is an outline. It's bullet points and nested bullet points. And an outline or outliner basically functions like a tree. So if you visualize a tree, you have the main trunk, which is like the main branch, and then you have branches sprouting out from that tree. And what does each branch has? It has leaves. So to stay with this analogy, the leaves are the individual bullets. So for example, this is a leaf. And then the branches are collections of nodes or blocks. So this is a branch. These 3 blocks or bullets together make a branch. Pretty straightforward, I think. If you think this is confusing, please put it in the chat. And then to say that something is a true outliner, I've looked at the definition by Dave Weiner. If you don't know Dave Weiner, he has been, he's a software developer, I would say an outline thinker. So he really thinks deeply about the concepts of outlining and outliners. And he posits that there should be 2 fundamental parts to make something a true outliner. The first one is expand and collapse. And the second core part is an idea called text on rails. And we'll get to that in a bit. But first, expand and collapse. Well, what is expand and collapse? This is expand and collapse. So when I click a bullet that has a child block, that has a nested node or block underneath, I can expand it or collapse it. I will get to this. It sounds very simple, but this really helps you to think more clearly and more precisely. And we'll get to it in a bit that works. So this is basically just to navigate your outline. So that's why expand and collapse are really important. But to work with an outline, to manipulate an outline, a second principle that needs to be um, in the outline is a concept called text on rails. So what that means is then when you move a node, that node or that block should stay on the same indentation level. And I'll demonstrate in a bit how it works in Rome. And why is this important? Because it helps you to easily reorganize your outlines without losing the relationships. You can easily, yeah. Well, let me just demonstrate it because I think that is way easier. So if we think of text on rails, we can actually see in Rome that this bar, you could see it as a rail. So the this bar by Rome is called the multi-bar, but you could see it as a rail. So let's say I am working with this outline and I want to restructure it. So I want this block number 2, text on rails, I want it to be the first point. Well, when a text is on rails, that means that with a simple keyboard shortcut, I can move it up while it stays on the same track. So in Rome, and I'm on Mac, I would use the keyboard combination Command Shift and then the up arrow to move it on the same rails up. So now I overtook, so to say, the expand and collapse block. Why is this important? Because some other outliners which really only approach outlining from an aesthetic perspective, when you do this, it will change the indentation level often. If that happens, you know you're not working with a true outliner. So if you move a block with a keyboard shortcut and it moves the indentation level, you know you're not working with a true outliner, because text on rails is a crucial part to quickly, first of all, navigate the outline, because, well, I can quickly go up just with my keyboard, but then I can also manipulate the structure. So that is one of the key principles why we need text on rails. So that's the basics of outliners. I'm curious what you think. If you have questions, put it in the chat. And if there are no questions, then we'll wait. Then we'll move on to the fundamentals of Rome. And these fundamental parts all lean on those two principles: expansion and expand and collapse, and text on rails. Let's see. I see two questions, by the way. So before we move on, Ivan, can you navigate with keyboard on the same indentation level? Yeah, I mean, basically. So now, as you can see here, in all these blocks are on the same indentation level. So when I just use the down arrow, I stay on the same level. To go deeper, I can use the command down key to expand the parent block. And now, by using the arrow key, I can move a level down, or an indented level. But by collapsing these blocks, I can easily stay on the same level. Then I see a question from Yes. Are there any prominent outliners that are not on rails? Obsidian. Obsidian is not a true outliner. There's the outliner plugin. It's not text on rails. So yeah. And I see Ed is calling in, so I'm just going to accept this call. And again, this is for me. Using this platform is also new, so I hope everything works well. Ed.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi, Ed.
Sorry, I'm sort of fumbling around with the new platform. That
What was the question? I missed the question. Sorry, I didn't read it.
what?
You were calling in with a question I saw, but I don't know what I cannot see what the
No,
question
so my
is.
name appeared as yes, and I wasn't sure how to change
Okay,
it.
sure. All right.
So that anyway, that was my question. So I
Perfect.
appreciate that
Yeah.
Obsidian is not a true outliner.
Yeah, and it's one example of a file and documents structure. So I would say the main paradigms in note taking are outliners on one hand, and then files and folders on the other hand. Having said that, Obsidian has some very neat plugins which enable you um, to create like much of an outliner structure, but then working with the blocks, moving them up, down, it shows that it's not text on rails. So there's no, like, the relationship itself doesn't really carry a lot of information. Whereas in Rome, if you would look at like under the hood, each block has so many attributes to indicate the relationship with the blocks
Right,
around
right.
it, that really gives it also a lot of possibilities with plugins. So that's also how things like Rome 42 work, and Workbench and queries. It all works through the indentation structure, which
So
tools like Obsidian
one
don't have.
question I have about the outliners on Rails or text on Rails. So Obsidian obviously is not one.
Hmm.
Rome is one, but has another potentially important attribute, which is that the each block is block addressable.
Yes.
Um, is that a feature of text on Rails, um, or
No,
is it
that's
an added feature of Rome?
it's a characteristic of a graph database. So if you would just have an outliner without the block references, without the individual approachable blocks, then you just have an outliner. Rome is basically an outliner smashed on top of a graph database. So a graph database basically treats all the blocks or all the bullets as individual nodes in a network. So it's really a networked database. The beauty of Rome is that you don't really need to get into that structure in the beginning. So that's why I'm beginning with like the concept talks I'm now planning, outliners being one, because the most basic structure that you can work with in Rome is just the outliner. So
Hmm.
graph is way more complex. It's a more complex idea, but because Rome is an outliner, it really lends itself well to being a graph, because each block, each bullet can be treated as an individual node. But in this talk, that is outside of the scope, because then, like you said, you work with block references and IDs, and well, you create structures in another way that way. Whereas now we're just talking about how do you use indentation to create meaning in your notes. That is basically the scope of this talk. Does that make sense?
Great. Yeah, it does make sense. Thank you.
Perfect. Perfect. I'll mute you just to be sure, if I can. I don't know if I can. Oh, perfect. Okay, let's continue. My screen is still shared. Yes. So we'll have a look at the 5 fundamentals of Rome, and they all tie back to the fundamentals of expand and collapse and text on rails. So the first fundamental is indentation, and that fundamental indentation also makes the other features possible. So this is basically a progressive, uh, a logical sequence of features that all come forth from the principle of indentation. So, but what is indentation? Well, this is indentation. If you're not familiar, like, I guess that everyone is familiar with indentation, but I prefer to be clear. Indentation means you have a block, and then the next block is moved one place to the right. So it's nested. We call it nested blocks. So by indenting nodes or blocks, you create relationships. There are two types of relationships in outliners. You have parent-child relationships and sibling relationships. So what do I mean with that? A parent node have one or more bullets nested underneath. So for example, fundamental one indentation is a parent block. And what is it the parent of? Well, it's parent of all these blocks that follow. So those are parent blocks. By the way, the block that follows, this one block, that block is both a child and a parent. It's a child of the block that comes directly before it, and it's the parent of these two blocks. And then these two blocks are siblings of each other. So they're child blocks of the upper block, but because they're on the same level, they're siblings. Siblings cannot see each other, and we'll see in a bit what that means. But even though it's called a sibling relationship, when I'm focused on this block, I cannot see the sibling relationships. I cannot see what's directly next on the same indentation level. What I can see when I'm zoomed in on a block is the hierarchy. So I can look up and down, anything that's nested up and nested down. So we'll have a look at how that works in a bit. But before, we'll revisit expand and collapse. And why is this so important? And I've talked with many Roam users, and this is what they all mention why they love expand and collapse is because when you collapse an outline, so only the parent blocks are visible, you create an overview. So you get like a 10,000 feet overview, just the same way we have here. So this is the high level overview of this talk, but I can zoom in and get a higher level of detail. So by expanding branches of nodes, I can drill down to a detail view. And the further indented, the more clicks I need to get to that detail. So I can progressively uncover the details as I go expanding the branches of blocks. So that is fundamental 2. And I've been demonstrating expand and collapse the whole time here. So this is basically it. This is expand and collapse. You can use the multi-bar, so the rails, so to say, to expand and collapse, or you can just use the little arrow next to the bullet. The consequence of indentation and expand and collapse and the way Roam treats blocks and branches makes another very important fundamental possible, namely focus or zoom. So what is this? Well, when I hover over a bullet, you can see it turns into this little click a link hand. So when I do that, I zoom in on this block. That means that I basically filter out everything that, like all the sibling blocks and the parent blocks are minimized. So again, sibling blocks are filtered out when I zoom into a block. And the parent blocks, we can see them here at the top, they're minimized. So being able to collapse and expand blocks is very neat to remove noise. But as you can see here, I still have a lot of noise here. So by clicking into a block, I remove all of that. And then what that does by zooming into a block, I don't just zoom into that block, I zoom into the branch from that block onward. So if that block has children blocks, I can see those when I'm zoomed in. So that is basically how it works. There's another way you can zoom into a block. Instead of clicking on the bullet, you can right click and you can use the focus on block option. As you can see here, there's also a shortcut. So Control O, that means that when I'm in the block with my cursor and I hit Control O on my keyboard, that I zoom in on that block. So as you can see, the way Roam does this, it's so frictionless. I've never seen an outliner do it like this. All right. So the consequence of having zoom or focus means that you can do some cool stuff with it. For example, the sidebar. So I will show this actually not in the main screen, but I will show this in the sidebar. Believe it or not, I've met Roam users who have been using Roam for like 3-4 months and are not aware of a thing called sidebar. So hopefully, if you're new to Roam, you now discover there's a thing called sidebar, which is extremely useful. And what it allows you to do is basically open, like zoom in on a branch, but in another part of the screen. Because when I hold the shift button and I click on the block, it will open in the sidebar. And by the way, I've opened it twice. As you can see here, it will open that branch or that bullet from this position. So fundamental 4 sidebar on. Again, you can see the rest of the branch here, the fundamental parts of an outliner, as you can see here, which is part of Grocking outliners, the pay or another parent block, and that parent block is part of August 25th, so today's date. The sidebar is, I would say, one of the most useful features in Roam. Why? Because this way you can zoom in on one or several branches and then navigate away to other blocks on the main screen. So here on the left-hand side, this is the main screen. And here on the right-hand side, you have the sidebar. So, like I said, you can open branches in the sidebar. And the sidebar basically helps you to see information in new contexts. Let's make this a little bit up. That is not good. The image is a little bit too big, so let's show it in the main window. So basically what you can do with the sidebar, you can create a subset of a page and then only use that part of the page and then move away on the main screen and see those blocks or those branches next to each other in new context. And I think that is one of the things that really make Roam such a good tool for serendipitous encounters. Not just the linking, but also being able to open branches on one hand side and then navigate the rest of your graph in the main screen. That is one of the things that makes it really powerful. Then fundamental 5, and I've already touched on this with the short conversation with Ed. Like the two main paradigms, I would say, in note taking are either file and folder based, like Obsidian, Evernote, even Notion, although Notion is almost like a hybrid. But not having to think about files or folders and just having to think in branches means that you can basically ditch the entire file and folder structure, which Roam has basically done. So even though when you think you're on a page in Roam, you're actually, the page name is a parent block, and then all those blocks on that page are the child blocks of that page name. So even when you're on a page, you're basically just in a branch of blocks. So Roam has gotten rid completely of pages, even though you can still see an option called pages. But under the hood, again, it's just a branch of blocks. And the way Roam leverages this idea of branches and individual blocks is they have a daily notes page, which is your entry point for basically anything. So it pins a block in time by associating that block with a date, but then you can directly approach that block in any way you want. So through search, through block references. So yeah, those are the main ways you can approach a block, even when it's not linked. So you can even use search to locate blocks. So those are the fundamentals. We'll see if there are any questions. Okay, no questions. Let's continue with the use cases for outliners. So An outliner is very useful. In my case, I use outliners for between 80 and 90% of the knowledge work that I do. So research, large part of my workflows is just outlining. So thinking through things in outline format. Um, but then like the last 10-20%, either it's a video I record or it's a linear piece that I write. So just be aware, outliners are awesome. Even a fanboy like me, I love outliners, but I don't use it for everything. So um, be aware of that. But what are the use cases for outliners? Well, um, the first use case is instead of having a very elaborate system. So instead of having to think beforehand of the structure or how you want to organize your notes, um, in Rome or any outliner, you don't need to do that. Why? Because you can add meaning through relationships between notes. What are the relationships again? Parent, child, and siblings. So those are the main relationships. How you do it in Rome is by just using the tab or the shift tab. So I will use shift tab now. That unindents it. So now this block has become sibling block of all these other blocks. By hitting tab, I make it the child block of the upper block. So that is how relationships are created in Rome. So if you want to quickly organize information, associate information, an outliner really is the easiest way, because you, again, with the text on Rails principle, you can quickly move blocks around using tab and shift tab. You can change the rails, so to say. And those are basically the only features you need to restructure an outline and to add or remove meaning from an outline. This is so different from a tool like Obsidian, where you would need to link to another page to create meaning or to create a relationship that has meaning. And plus, you would need to give some context so you can link to another page in Obsidian. But why are you linking to that page in Obsidian? Whereas if I indent a block in Rome, I know, because of the way outliners work, that is a more nuanced thought that follows the thought before. So the thought that is in the parent block is refined by the child block. That is how I treat outliners and how most outline fans use outliners. And again, that's also how you create the structure of a rough overview by just looking at the parent blocks and then progressively digging into the detailed view by expanding the child blocks. So that is actually how you create meaning. The meaning is in the indentation. And this is a really neat image that I found on Chris, Rome Hacker's Twitter account. So this is basically how an outline works, how the relationships work. I like it to be visualized this way, but as we'll see in a bit, an outliner can basically come in in many formats, but and Rome is just one application of an outliner. Then, second use case, outliners make you a clear thinker. What does that mean? Well, we've already covered the 10,000 feet overview, just looking at the parent blocks. What does that do? Well, it filters out all the noise. But by structuring things that way, you're also forced to break things down in their atomic parts. So having the 10,000 feet overview, you can filter out a lot of noise. And then by adding those details, by breaking down ideas in their atomic parts, you can structure an idea much more easily. So it helps you to become a clear thinker. And by using indentation, by using a progressively nuanced view of things, by using indentation, you learn to reason, you learn to apply logic, because you have, for example, one statement that is then exported by the child block, and that child block maybe leads to another insight that you then flesh out in a child block underneath. So that is how you can become a clearer thinker. But then when you want to take in only what you need at the moment, you go to the parent blocks, which contain maybe a summary of all the blocks that come after. Having those details also makes you a precise thinker, because you can go from a high level overview, having a lot of clarity, but not a high resolution of details. You can drill down into a specific branch, and by expanding the progressive blocks, you can drill down and see the nuance. Then when it comes to writing, so this is just getting your thoughts out, but your thoughts are externalized using writing. So using an outline, I've heard many Roam users mention this, that they feel like they write way more since they've started to use Roam. Because why? It makes it frictionless. Like what I just shown here, relationships are added or removed using tab or shift tab. You don't need to create a new page. You don't need to link to that page. You just hit tab. And it really makes writing frictionless. And why is this important? Because switching context, it's very expensive, especially if you have ADHD. You'll know that like people with ADHD naturally jump from context to context just because they're distracted the whole time, or their mind is triggered by something, and then they move to another context, and at the end they're exhausted. I mean, I can speak from experience. But outliners reduce that cost, because I can very easily collapse or expand a branch. I can zoom into a branch. So it makes switching context almost free. I'm not saying it's completely free, it's cheap. And when you can switch context, when like ideas pop up and you can quickly write them down in different contexts without having a lot of overhead of having to switch pages or apps, that will automatically lead to a flow state. This atomic nature actually also removes the need to structure as you're writing, because as I've shown before, you can easily use tab, shift tab, or the command shift to move around blocks on the page or entire branches. So basically, if you want, you can write down a linear list of blocks, and then when you're done, you can add structure to it very easily just using your keyboard. So that is another way that Roam makes writing frictionless, or outliners in general, true outliners in general. And then, like I said before, outliners let you jump between streams of thought, because switching context is so cheap, you can easily, whenever you have an idea, open up maybe a page in the sidebar, or look for a block and open it in the sidebar and just add some thoughts to it and then close it. Because why wouldn't you? It's so cheap. So those are the use cases for outliners. And I see we're moving quickly. If there are no questions, I will just continue. No, let's pause for a bit. I want to hear in the chat from anyone who still is confused about outliners, or who still thinks, why would I use an outliner? I don't get it. Let's see. No questions. All right. So let's then just jump into how to grok outliners. And what I mean with grokking means, understand deeply, intuitively. So having to think of these principles when you just start using Roam, that's fine. It takes time to start to think this way and to effortlessly navigate your branches and your outlines. But there are a few examples you can see like in the wild. And once I understood the principles of outliners, I started to see them everywhere. So even in forms that I hadn't considered them being an outliner. So The first rule, if you want to better understand outliners, is to look for tree-like structures in reality. So in in nature, if you look at plants, if you look at different natural occurrences like rock formations and everything, like things tend to be have a fractal nature. So being fractal, you can create like new shapes because a fractal is basically a repeating shape. And I saw this GIF on Twitter, someone explaining to me this. When they saw this image, they suddenly understood, oh my goodness, having blocks, being able to organize them in different ways, it's basically a fractal pattern. So look for fractal patterns in reality if you still do not understand outlines. A little bit less abstract approach to understanding outlines is to look at sketches or like connected sketches with arrows or mind maps or even a bullet journal. Bullet journal is basically just one big outline. But diagrams as well. Like these are all examples of outline structures. So you have an organizational diagram, you have a tree diagram, you have an arsing diagram. And as you can see here, like there are hierarchies and relationships in all. So what does this mean? That even though we tend to think of outlines as this, just bullets with indentations, you can also think of an outline as a tree diagram. Because, for example, here, node 1 is the parent node, and this parent node has a child node, 3, which in turn is again a parent node of 6 and 5. So as you can see here, you can go from top to bottom, you can go from left to right. It doesn't really matter, just as long as there is like a split in between values. So for example, one value can be the parent of one value can be the parent of two other values. Then you're basically looking at an outliner. It's not very complicated, and you can see it everywhere. Mind maps, you have one word in the middle and then all these branches that come out, and then you have words that directly originate from the first word, but then the word that follows from that again has other branches. Again, that is basically an outliner. And the easiest way to look at an outliner is just to look at a table of contents. So see the chapters as the parent nodes and then the indented sections as child and sibling nodes. That is the easiest way to understand outliners. And actually, I talked to Chris Romehacker, and he told me that when he understood that a table of contents is basically an outline, that was the moment it hit for him that he thought, I can create this. It's not this complicated. I can create indented blocks and create associations that way. So the fundamentals of outlines. I went through this pretty quickly, about 40 minutes. I'm curious if you have any questions or doubts or confusions. Feel free to speak up, to unmute yourself, or to put it in the chat. And I'm also curious to hear if you went into this session like almost like a blank slate, that you knew what an outline was, but didn't know all the different moving parts of an outliner. I'm curious to hear what parts were new for you, or that surprised you, that you thought, I've never seen it this way, and maybe could be useful for your future work. I would love to hear your takeaways. Ivan, I am interested in seeing your workflow using outliners to write essays. I think you've been looking at my process already. I can show you a little bit more how this presentation came to be. So how I started. I started well, if we really go to the root, we need to take a look at the content triangle. So there's this idea I picked up from David Perel, who has this course called not Building a Second Brain, Rite of Passage, but he works with Tiago Forte, who does Building a Second Brain. This is basically my process for getting ideas, fleshing them out, turning them into an outline, then turning them into a piece, an article. So often I have a conversation, for example, Chris, Rome Hacker, like there's a dialogue back and forth, me asking questions, him giving clarifications. I mean, he's been in the outliner game for way longer than me. So that is basically the feedback. I share my distillation through Twitter. I create something out of it. I have an additional creation step, this session being one. So by talking out loud, by taking you through my outline, which you've just seen is the outline for my article I'm writing, I'm gathering more feedback, and I'm basically discovering what is unclear or what is superfluous. And then finally, I create a written piece and I distribute it. So that is my core writing process. And this is called the content triangle. Not all ideas progress from a conversation to a newsletter, for example. But core concepts like this, for example, outliners, the concept of outliners, I've been chewing on this for maybe a month. And this is the you're meeting me somewhere in the middle of my process of thinking this through. Okay. Then I took another approach. I went to Twitter and I asked people, what was it in Rome or in Logsec, because Logsec is also an outliner that works really well for the stuff that I've shown here. What was it that made it click for you? And then some people, well, I think over 30 people shared their insights with me. So what I then do is I reference these. So it sucks. I should have saved like the intermediate stage, but basically, what I start out with is short statements. For example, short statement is an outliner is a tree-like structure, and then nested underneath, I have the tweet that references to that idea, or that gave me that idea that outliners are basically tree-like structures. But then I turn it into a little bit more of a refined statement or note. So that is the next step. So as you can see here, this line used to be outliners let you structure your thoughts in a tree-like structure, period. And then nested underneath, I had the tweet. Then the second pass, I elaborated a little bit on it, saying individual bullets nodes are the leaves and collections of nested bullets form the branches. And again, I reference this tweet to quickly be able to go to the context where I found it. And this is basically how I form my my outline. So this is a very, very rough outline. I have some stuff that I haven't used. So I took this outline and then I opened this up next to, Typefully. And Typefully is just a little app to create Twitter threads. And this is the one that I tweeted out today. So I'm basically taking this outline and I'm just starting at the top and I write tweets. So I look at bullets and little branches to create tweets. For example, here, let's see. I've used this block to create this first tweet in the thread. So this is already a more distilled way of working. So I'm actually organizing my thoughts. I'm writing in a linear way. I will go back and forth in this outline because sometimes when writing in a linear format, some ideas need to precede other ideas. So I need to give some context. And that is what this thread helps me with. So writing a Twitter thread, helps me to reason in a logical sequence. So it helps me to turn an outline into a linear piece already. And then I use this Twitter thread to create the outline of this session, what I've just shown before when I was sharing my screen. So that is basically my process. And now that I have a really fleshed out outline, basically already linear and already with full sentences, I can really easily, probably within an hour, I can turn that into a complete blog post with some images because I've already collected some images from Twitter. And that is basically my process. So I take the content triangle, have a conversation, start to think about an idea, write a little bit about it, do some research, all in Rome. Then I take it outside. So I tweet about it to get more feedback, to organize my thoughts. And then I use that Twitter thread basically as an outline for the blog post. Or if I have a session, I use that as like a fleshed out outline for the session. So that is beginning to end my process.